The fluorescent lights in the courthouse lobby buzzed faintly, casting a pale glow over the polished floors and towering walls. Judge Alicia Monroe, a poised and accomplished woman, gripped the handle of her leather briefcase as she stepped through the entrance. Her black robe, folded neatly over her arm, bore the weight of her hard-earned authority. Yet today, it wasn't just the trials on her docket weighing on her shoulders. The faint whispers and sidelong glances she had felt all morning hinted at something else, a tension lingering in the air like a storm cloud. Her pulse quickened as she approached the security checkpoint. Alicia was no stranger to the courthouse staff, yet the look on Officer Daniels' face as their eyes met was anything but familiar. His lips curled into a smug smile, the kind that seemed to dare her to speak first. Daniels was notorious for his arrogance, a man who wielded his badge like a weapon and thrived on intimidating those who crossed his path. Alicia had dealt with men like him before, people who saw her title, her success, and her skin color as contradictions rather than accomplishments. But today felt different. There was something darker in the way he leaned casually against the metal detector, his icy blue eyes narrowing as she approached. "Judge Monroe," he greeted, his voice dripping with mock respect, "you don't look like someone who should be presiding over a courtroom today." Alicia paused, her heart steady despite the simmering indignation beneath her composed exterior. She met his gaze with an unflinching calm, her expression unreadable but her mind racing. The condescension in his voice was deliberate, calculated to provoke a reaction. She had faced prejudice before, but this wasn't just about her. It was about the principles she had dedicated her career to upholding: justice, fairness, and accountability. And this time, it wasn't happening behind closed doors. Other officers lingered nearby, their eyes flickering between Daniels and Alicia, uneasy but silent. "Funny," she replied coolly, tilting her head just slightly. "You don't look like someone who enforces the law without bias. Shall we test which of us is wrong?" The room seemed to hold its breath. Daniels straightened, his smirk fading into a thin line of irritation. He gestured toward a side table with a sharp, impatient movement. "Step over here, Judge. We've got procedures to follow." Alicia's heels clicked against the tile as she complied, her every step measured but resolute. She placed her briefcase on the table, her calm demeanor never faltering. Daniels began inspecting it, his movements exaggerated, as though he were searching for contraband, rather than glancing at a routine piece of luggage. As he picked up her badge, turning it over in his hands with an almost theatrical scrutiny, his smirk returned. "This doesn't look very official to me," he said, holding it up to the light. "Sure you didn't just print this out at home?" A ripple of unease swept through the room. The other officers exchanged glances, but none intervened. Alicia felt the weight of their silence, a tacit complicity that only deepened her resolve. She had been here before, in moments where her authority was questioned, not because of her competence, but because of who she was. This time, however, there were witnesses, and that meant there was an opportunity. "Perhaps," she said evenly, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips, "if you spent less time questioning what's in plain sight and more time familiarizing yourself with the credentials of court officials, you wouldn't embarrass yourself like this." Daniel's eyes flashed with something dangerous, anger, perhaps, or the realization that he had underestimated her. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice to a near whisper. "You've got a lot to say for someone under my watch." Alicia didn't flinch. "And you've got a lot to answer for as someone abusing their authority." The tension was electric, the air thick with unspoken challenges. Daniels, visibly bristling, turned toward the radio clipped to his uniform. "Dispatch, I need verification on a suspicious ID," he said loudly, his words chosen more for effect than accuracy. Alicia stood motionless, her composure unshaken. She let the silence stretch, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Finally, she spoke, her voice calm but edged with steel. "Suspicious, is it? Perhaps we should escalate this. Call your supervisor. I'm sure they'd love to hear why a judge's badge is raising alarms today." Daniels hesitated, his bravado cracking at the suggestion. The power dynamic in the room shifted. Nearby, one of the older officers, a man whose experience was etched into his face, stepped forward, his voice steady but firm. "Judge Monroe, if I may," he said, "this inspection isn't standard procedure. I apologize for the inconvenience." Alicia acknowledged him with a slight nod, her tone resolute. "Thank you for your honesty. It's refreshing." The older officer turned to Daniels, his expression hardening. "Hand the judge back her badge." Daniels' jaw tightened, his hands clenching as he reluctantly extended the badge toward Alicia. She took it with deliberate precision, her gaze never leaving his. "Thank you," she said, her voice neutral but firm. "Now the apology." Daniel's face flushed crimson, his discomfort visible to everyone in the room. He mumbled something barely audible, but Alicia didn't let it slide. "Louder," she demanded, her tone unwavering. "I want everyone to hear it." The room fell silent as Daniels, his shoulders slumping, repeated himself louder. "I'm sorry." Alicia slipped the badge into her briefcase and nodded. "Apology accepted, but this isn't over." As she walked away, her heels clicking against the polished floor, she felt the weight of every eye in the room on her back. She had won this battle, but the fight was far from finished. The courthouse doors loomed ahead, and with them, the promise of another confrontation, one that would demand more than her composure. It would require unyielding resolve, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been silenced in the face of prejudice. And as she stepped into the courtroom, the question hung in the air, unanswered but potent. What happens when those sworn to uphold justice are the very ones who undermine it? The courtroom buzzed softly as people shuffled papers, adjusted their seats, and whispered among themselves. Judge Alicia Monroe entered with her head held high, her steps measured and deliberate. The usual hum of chatter quieted as she approached the bench, her presence commanding respect without the need for words. But underneath her calm exterior, Alicia's mind churned. The encounter with Officer Daniels still lingered like a bitter taste. His arrogance wasn't new, but the brazenness of his actions had touched a nerve. This wasn't just about her. It was about what his behavior represented, the unspoken challenges woven into the very fabric of her career. As she settled into her chair, Alicia allowed her gaze to sweep over the room. The jury box was empty for now, the first case of the day yet to begin. Attorneys organized their notes, and a few familiar faces among the clerks offered her polite nods. She returned their greetings with a small smile, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Daniel's smirk, the weight of his disdain, and the uneasy silence of the other officers replayed in her mind. This wasn't just a power struggle. It was a moment that laid bare the undercurrents of prejudice she had been fighting against her whole life. Alicia's path to the bench had been anything but easy. She had grown up in a small, tight-knit community where opportunities felt like whispers on the wind, rare and fleeting. Her parents, both teachers, had instilled in her a fierce belief in education and justice. They had taught her that hard work and integrity could carve a path even through the most formidable barriers. But no amount of preparation had truly equipped her for the battles she would face once she stepped into the world of law. From her early days as a public defender to her rise as a judge, Alicia had encountered skepticism, outright hostility, and a constant need to prove her worth. She had learned to recognize the subtle slights, the way certain colleagues dismissed her ideas or hesitated to meet her gaze. And she had grown adept at responding with quiet strength, knowing that every step forward was a victory not just for her, but for those who would come after her. Still, there were days when the weight of it all felt heavy. Today was one of those days. Alicia glanced at the clock. The first hearing was set to begin in 10 minutes, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the morning's events weren't finished with her yet. Her instincts, honed over years of navigating both legal battles and personal ones, told her that Daniels wasn't the type to let things go. The smugness in his tone, the deliberate way he had tried to undermine her authority, it all pointed to a man who thrived on pushing boundaries. And while Alicia had won their initial confrontation, she suspected he might try to strike back in some way. Her thoughts were interrupted by a light knock on the side door of the courtroom. It opened to reveal Sarah, her clerk, a young woman with a knack for organization and a sharp mind. Sarah stepped inside, her expression carefully neutral but her eyes betraying a flicker of unease. "Judge Monroe," Sarah began, her voice quiet but steady, "there's been an incident." Alicia's heart sank slightly, though her face remained calm. "What kind of incident?" she asked, setting down her pen. "It's Officer Daniels," Sarah replied, hesitating for a moment before continuing. "He's filed a complaint." The words hung in the air, sharp and heavy. Alicia took a slow breath, her mind already racing through the possibilities. Daniels wasn't just arrogant, he was strategic. A complaint against her could be a way to shift the narrative, to cast doubt on her authority and paint her as the one at fault. It wouldn't be the first time someone had tried to weaponize the system against her. "What's the nature of the complaint?" Alicia asked, her tone measured. Sarah hesitated again. "He's claiming you were unprofessional during the security check, that you threatened him." The absurdity of the accusation made Alicia's pulse quicken. She had been firm, yes, but threatening? The claim was laughable, but she knew better than to dismiss it outright. Allegations like this, even when baseless, had a way of lingering. They could sow doubt, fuel gossip, and create distractions that undermined the real work she was there to do. "Thank you, Sarah," Alicia said finally, her voice steady. "Please make sure the court administrator is informed. And let them know I'll address the matter directly." Sarah nodded and left the room, leaving Alicia alone with her thoughts once more. She leaned back in her chair, her fingers brushing lightly against the smooth surface of her desk. Daniel's move was calculated, that much was clear, but what he hadn't counted on was her resolve. Alicia had spent her entire career navigating challenges like this. She wasn't about to let his pettiness derail her. The door to the courtroom opened again, this time admitting the attorneys for the first case. Alicia straightened, slipping into her professional demeanor with ease. Whatever Daniels was planning, it would have to wait. For now, her focus was on the work at hand, the work that truly mattered. As the case began, Alicia listened intently, her questions precise and her tone even. But beneath the surface, her thoughts churned. She would handle Daniels, not just for herself, but for the message it would send. Authority wasn't a shield for abuse, and accountability wasn't optional. She had spent her life proving that justice was more than a word. And if Daniels wanted a fight, she was ready to meet him on her terms. The session concluded smoothly, and as the courtroom emptied, Alicia felt a flicker of satisfaction. She had done what she always did, carried out her duty with fairness and integrity. But as she gathered her papers and prepared to leave the bench, a figure lingering near the back of the room caught her eye. It was one of the older officers from the morning, the one who had intervened when Daniels had crossed the line. He hesitated for a moment before approaching, his expression thoughtful. "Judge Monroe," he began, his voice low, "I wanted to apologize again for what happened earlier." Alicia regarded him carefully. There was sincerity in his tone, and perhaps a touch of regret. "I appreciate that," she said. "But the apology should come from Officer Daniels." The officer nodded, his gaze steady. "It should," he agreed. "But there's something you should know about Daniels. He's been like this for years. Gets away with it because no one wants to deal with the hassle of calling him out." Alicia felt a spark of anger, not at the officer in front of her, but at the system that allowed people like Daniels to thrive. "Well," she said, her tone firm, "that ends now." The officer hesitated, as though weighing his next words carefully. "If you need anything, support, witnesses, let me know. There are more people on your side than you might think." Alicia nodded, a small but genuine smile breaking through her composed exterior. "Thank you. That means a lot." As the officer left, Alicia felt a renewed sense of determination. Daniels had tried to shake her, but all he had done was strengthen her resolve. She didn't know exactly what his next move would be, but she knew one thing for certain: she wouldn't back down. Not today, not ever. The courthouse hallways seemed quieter than usual as Alicia walked briskly toward her chambers. The sound of her heels on the polished floors echoed faintly, a steady rhythm that matched her thoughts. Officer Daniels' complaint wasn't just a simple misunderstanding or a clash of personalities. It was an intentional attempt to undermine her credibility. She couldn't let it stand, not just for herself, but for every person who faced similar prejudice without the power to push back. As Alicia rounded a corner, she noticed Sarah waiting outside her office, a folder clutched tightly in her hands. The young clerk's expression was a mixture of concern and determination, and Alicia felt a pang of gratitude. Sarah was loyal, sharp, and clearly ready to assist with whatever was coming next. "I pulled the security footage from this morning," Sarah said quietly as Alicia approached. "I thought you might want to see it before things escalate." Alicia nodded, motioning for Sarah to follow her inside. Once they were behind the closed door of her chambers, Alicia took a seat at her desk while Sarah set up the video on a laptop. The screen flickered to life, showing a grainy but clear view of the security checkpoint where the morning's confrontation had unfolded. As the footage played, Alicia watched herself interact with Daniels. Her movements were calm and deliberate, her tone firm but far from threatening. Daniels, on the other hand, radiated hostility. His exaggerated inspection of her badge, his smug expression, and the way he leaned in closer than necessary. It was all there, undeniable and unedited. Sarah paused the video and glanced at Alicia. "It's pretty clear who was out of line," she said, her voice steady but tinged with frustration. "But you know how these things can go. Sometimes the truth doesn't matter as much as the story people want to tell." Alicia leaned back in her chair, her gaze fixed on the frozen image of Daniels on the screen. Sarah was right. Facts alone weren't always enough, especially when biases and preconceptions clouded judgment. But Alicia had learned to navigate those waters with precision. She wouldn't let Daniels twist the narrative to suit his agenda. "Thank you, Sarah," Alicia said finally. "Make sure the administrator gets a copy of this footage, and keep the original safe. We might need it." Sarah nodded and left the room, leaving Alicia alone with her thoughts once more. She stared at the screen for a moment longer before closing the laptop. The footage was her ace, but she knew she couldn't rely on it alone. She needed to anticipate Daniel's next move and counter it before he had a chance to gain traction. Later that afternoon, Alicia received an unexpected visit from Marcus, a senior attorney she had worked with years ago. Marcus was sharp, intuitive, and well-connected, a man who seemed to know everything happening in the courthouse before anyone else. "I heard about Daniels," Marcus said as he took a seat across from Alicia. "Word travels fast around here." Alicia raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly have you heard?" Marcus leaned back, a thoughtful expression on his face. "He's been talking. Nothing official yet, but he's planting seeds, telling people you overstepped, that you tried to use your position to intimidate him." Alicia felt her jaw tighten. It was infuriating, but not surprising. Daniels was playing a classic game, spreading doubt and shaping perceptions before the truth had a chance to take hold. "And people are buying it?" she asked, her tone calm but sharp. Marcus shrugged. "Some maybe, but most people know who Daniels is. His reputation isn't exactly spotless. The problem is he's good at stirring the pot. If this drags on too long, it could become a distraction." Alicia nodded slowly. Marcus was right. She needed to address the situation quickly and decisively, but without giving Daniels the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. This wasn't just about clearing her name. It was about sending a message that abuse of power wouldn't be tolerated, no matter where it came from. "Thanks for the heads up," Alicia said. "I'll handle it." Marcus smiled faintly. "I never doubted that. Just let me know if you need backup." As Marcus left, Alicia felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had faced bigger challenges than this and come out stronger. Daniels might think he had the upper hand, but he didn't understand who he was dealing with. Alicia wasn't just a judge, she was a fighter, and she wasn't afraid to stand up for what was right. That evening, as Alicia prepared to leave the courthouse, she noticed a small group of officers gathered near the exit. Among them was Daniels, his posture casual but his eyes sharp. He glanced in her direction, and for a moment, their gazes met. His smirk returned, a silent challenge that made Alicia's resolve harden even further. She walked past without a word, her head held high. The tension was palpable, but Alicia knew better than to engage on his terms. This wasn't a game she was going to lose. As she stepped into the crisp evening air, Alicia allowed herself a small smile. The battle was far from over, but she was ready for whatever came next. Daniels might have underestimated her, but he would soon learn what it meant to face someone who refused to back down. The next morning, Alicia arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual. The sun was barely up, casting a faint glow across the city, and the quiet was almost unnerving. As she walked through the empty halls, her thoughts were sharp and focused. Today felt different, charged, as though something significant was about to happen. When she reached her chambers, Sarah was already there, her expression serious. She handed Alicia a thin envelope, her hand lingering for a moment before letting go. "This was slipped under your door," Sarah said quietly. "I thought you'd want to see it right away." Alicia opened the envelope and unfolded the paper inside. It was a typed note, unsigned, but the message was clear and chilling. Asterisk, drop this, or you'll regret it. Some battles aren't worth fighting. Asterisk. Alicia read the words twice, her jaw tightening. The threat was veiled but unmistakable. It wasn't just Daniels she was dealing with anymore. There was something larger at play, something that extended beyond one man's bruised ego. She placed the note on her desk and looked up at Sarah. "Have you shown this to anyone else?" Alicia asked. Sarah shook her head. "No, I thought it was best to bring it straight to you." Alicia nodded, grateful for Sarah's discretion. "Let's keep it that way for now, but scan it and make sure we have a copy on file." Sarah hesitated. "Do you think this is connected to Daniels?" Alicia sighed, her fingers drumming lightly on the desk. "It's possible, but whoever sent this, they're trying to intimidate me. They think they can scare me into silence." Sarah's expression hardened. "They don't know you very well, do they?" Alicia allowed herself a small smile. "Apparently not." As the day unfolded, the courthouse buzzed with activity, the usual hum of legal proceedings mixed with whispers about Alicia and Daniels. The security footage had made its way to the administrator, and an internal review was already underway. Daniels was being questioned, but Alicia knew that wouldn't be enough to stop him or whoever might be backing him. By midday, Alicia found herself in the courtroom, presiding over a routine case. But even as she focused on the proceedings, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The courtroom felt different, the air heavy with unspoken tension. She noticed Daniels sitting in the back, his presence deliberate. He wasn't assigned to her courtroom, yet there he was, arms crossed and a smug expression on his face. Alicia continued as though she hadn't seen him, her voice steady as she delivered her rulings. But inside, her mind was racing. Daniels was making a statement, trying to rattle her. It was a calculated move, and she wouldn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. After court adjourned, Alicia returned to her chambers, her steps measured but her heart pounding. As she entered, Marcus was waiting for her, his face grim. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. Alicia closed the door and motioned for him to sit. "What is it?" Marcus leaned forward, his voice low. "I've been digging, and it looks like Daniels isn't acting alone. There's a group, officers, and a few others in administration. Both been pushing back against reforms you've supported. They're using Daniels as a pawn to discredit you." Alicia's stomach churned, but she kept her expression neutral. "And the note?" Marcus nodded. "Most likely tied to them. They're trying to protect their interests, and you're a threat." Alicia exhaled slowly, her resolve hardening. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed added weight to the situation. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the system and the people who were desperate to maintain the status quo. "What do we do?" she asked. Marcus smiled faintly. "We keep fighting, but you need to be careful. These people play dirty, and they won't stop until they feel they've won." As Marcus left, Alicia sat in silence, the weight of the situation settling heavily on her shoulders. She glanced at the note again, its words a stark reminder of the challenges ahead. But fear wasn't an option. She had come too far and fought too hard to back down now. That evening, as Alicia drove home, her phone buzzed with a message from Sarah. It was a simple line, but it sent a jolt through Alicia. Asterisk, they've called an emergency meeting tomorrow morning. Be ready. Asterisk. Alicia gripped the steering wheel tighter, her mind racing. The pieces were falling into place, and the confrontation she had been anticipating was now inevitable. The stakes were higher than ever, and the outcome would define not only her future, but the integrity of the system she had dedicated her life to defending. As the city lights blurred past her, Alicia felt a surge of determination. The fight was far from over, but she was ready to face whatever came next. Tomorrow would be the turning point, and she would make sure the truth prevailed, no matter the cost. The next morning, the courthouse buzzed with an uneasy energy as Alicia arrived, her heels clicking sharply against the tiled floor. She felt the weight of every glance thrown her way, some supportive, others skeptical. The emergency meeting loomed in her mind, but she pushed aside the unease, reminding herself why she was here. This was no longer just about Daniels or the note. It was about standing her ground in a system that thrived on intimidation and silence. As she entered the meeting room, the tension was palpable. The table was surrounded by key players, senior judges, courthouse administrators, and a handful of security officials, including Daniels, who sat with an air of defiance. Alicia took her seat, her expression calm but unyielding, and waited for the meeting to begin. The administrator, a composed woman named Margaret Hayes, cleared her throat. "We're here to address allegations of misconduct and procedural violations," she began, her eyes sweeping across the room. "This is not a trial, but a review of facts. Judge Monroe, as you're central to these concerns, I trust you'll provide full transparency." Alicia met Margaret's gaze with steady resolve. "Absolutely. I welcome the chance to clarify the truth." Margaret nodded. "Good. Officer Daniels, let's start with your account." Daniels leaned forward, his voice measured but laced with subtle hostility. He painted a picture of misunderstanding, claiming he was simply following procedure when Alicia allegedly overreacted. His tone was calculated, designed to sob doubt without appearing overtly accusatory. But Alicia noticed something beneath his calm exterior, a flicker of unease. He was too rehearsed, his words too polished, as though he'd been coached. As Daniel spoke, Alicia's mind worked furiously, piecing together the fragments of a larger picture. When it was her turn to respond, Alicia didn't waste time. She recounted the events with precision, her tone steady and professional. She referenced the security footage, which had already been submitted as evidence, and emphasized the patterns of bias that had preceded the incident. Her words were clear, leaving little room for misinterpretation. But just as the discussion seemed to lean in Alicia's favor, a junior administrator entered the room, clutching a folder. He whispered something to Margaret, who frowned and opened the folder. After scanning its contents, she looked up, her expression unreadable. "Judge Monroe," Margaret said, her tone measured, "we've received an additional piece of evidence that complicates this matter. It appears there's a complaint against you, a formal one, submitted anonymously." The room fell silent. Alicia's heart skipped a beat, but her face remained composed. She leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but firm. "May I see it?" Margaret slid the folder across the table. Alicia opened it, scanning the document inside. The complaint alleged improper conduct on her part, claims that were vague but damaging enough to cast doubt. The timing was no coincidence. "This is a distraction," Alicia said, looking up. "It's an attempt to undermine my credibility because someone doesn't want the truth exposed." Daniel smirked, the faintest hint of satisfaction crossing his face. Alicia's instincts screamed that this was his doing, or at least that he was involved. But as she studied the complaint further, a chilling realization dawned. The language, the phrasing, it wasn't just Daniel's. This was bigger. Someone with influence was orchestrating this. Margaret raised a hand, her tone diplomatic. "Judge Monroe, I understand your frustration, but we must investigate all claims thoroughly. That's our responsibility." Alicia nodded, knowing she couldn't argue the point without seeming defensive. "I agree, but I also request that the source of this complaint be identified. Anonymous allegations are a tool for cowards." The room stirred with murmurs, and Margaret hesitated before responding. "We'll take that under advisement." As the meeting adjourned, Alicia felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Daniels exited with a triumphant swagger, but it wasn't him she was worried about. It was the shadows behind him, the unseen forces pulling the strings. Later that afternoon, as Alicia sat in her chambers, Marcus entered, his expression grim. He closed the door behind him and placed a file on her desk. "You were right," he said quietly. "That complaint wasn't random. It traces back to a law firm with ties to the department's old guard, the ones who've been pushing back against reform." Alicia's eyes narrowed as she opened the file. Inside were documents linking the firm to several high-profile cases where accountability had been dodged. The same names kept appearing, and one stood out: a prominent attorney with deep connections to both the courthouse and the police department. "They're protecting their own," Marcus continued, "and they're willing to throw you under the bus to do it." Alicia closed the file, her mind racing. This wasn't just a smear campaign. It was a calculated effort to silence her and maintain a broken system. The stakes had never been higher, and the battle was far from over. But then, a knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Sarah entered, her face pale. "Judge Monroe," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "There's someone here to see you. They say they have information about Daniels, and it's urgent." Alicia exchanged a glance with Marcus, who nodded. "Let them in," she said. Moments later, a woman stepped into the room. She looked nervous, clutching a folder to her chest, but her eyes held a determination that mirrored Alicia's own. "My name is Rachel," she began, her voice shaking. "I'm a former officer. I worked with Daniels, and I know things about him that you need to hear." Alicia gestured for her to sit, her curiosity piqued. "Go on." Rachel took a deep breath. "Daniels isn't just a bad cop. He's been involved in things that go way beyond what happened to you. And if you're willing to listen, I can prove it." Alicia leaned forward, her focus sharp. The stakes had just been raised, and the path ahead was clearer than ever. But with every revelation came new risks, and Alicia knew the battle was about to reach a dangerous turning point. Alicia sat across from Rachel, her gaze unwavering as the former officer began to unravel a story that made the tension in the room almost unbearable. Rachel's voice quivered at first, but as she continued, her resolve grew stronger. She explained how Daniels had used his position to intimidate others, bend rules, and conceal his actions under the guise of authority. But it wasn't just him. He was part of a broader network, officers and officials complicit in maintaining the status quo, with Daniels as a willing pawn in their game. Rachel slid the folder across the table. "This is everything I've collected," she said. "Records, conversations, patterns of behavior. It's enough to raise questions, if not bring him down." Alicia opened the folder and felt a chill run through her. The evidence wasn't just compelling, it was damning. There were transcripts of conversations, copies of falsified reports, and even emails that hinted at collusion between Daniels and other key figures. This wasn't just a case of personal bias. It was systemic corruption. But as Alicia scanned the documents, one detail jumped out at her, making her heart stop. Among the emails was a name she hadn't expected to see: Margaret Hayes, the courthouse administrator. Alicia's mind raced as she tried to piece it together. Margaret had always presented herself as neutral, even progressive. But now it seemed she wasn't just an observer, she was actively involved. Rachel leaned forward, her voice urgent. "I know this is a lot to process, but Daniels isn't working alone. He's just the visible part of something much bigger. They're protecting each other, and they'll do anything to keep their secrets." Alicia closed the folder, her resolve hardening. "Thank you for bringing this to me. I'll make sure it's used the right way." Rachel nodded, her relief palpable. "Be careful, Judge Monroe. They don't play fair." That night, Alicia stayed in her chambers long after the courthouse had emptied, poring over the evidence. The more she read, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about Daniel's misconduct or even Margaret's betrayal. It was about a culture of impunity, deeply entrenched and fiercely defended. The following morning, Alicia took a calculated risk. She reached out to a trusted journalist she had worked with in the past, someone known for exposing corruption. She provided enough information to spark interest, careful not to reveal too much too soon. "If anything happens to me," she said firmly, "this story needs to come out." That day, as Alicia prepared to confront Daniels and Margaret, the air in the courthouse felt different. News of the emergency meeting had spread, and whispers filled the halls. Everyone seemed to sense that something significant was about to unfold. When the meeting began, Margaret's usual composure seemed slightly strained, though she tried to mask it. Daniels, on the other hand, appeared smug, as if he believed the scales were tipped in his favor. Alicia, however, was ready. She began by addressing the anonymous complaint. "This document," she said, holding it up, "was clearly designed to discredit me. But what's more interesting than the complaint itself is the trail it leaves behind." She looked directly at Margaret, her tone sharp but measured. "It's linked to a law firm with ties to individuals in this very courthouse." Margaret's face tightened, but she said nothing. Alicia continued, turning her attention to Daniels. "And as for Officer Daniels, the pattern of behavior he's exhibited isn't just unprofessional, it's unethical. And I have evidence to prove it." Before Daniels could respond, Alicia placed the folder on the table and opened it. She laid out the documents methodically, her voice calm but firm, as she explained each piece of evidence. The room grew quieter with every word, the weight of the revelation sinking in. Daniels shifted in his seat, his confidence evaporating. "This is a smear campaign," he stammered. "You're trying to ruin me because I dare to question you." Alicia met his gaze. "What you call questioning, I call harassment. And the evidence speaks for itself." Margaret finally spoke, her voice tight. "Judge Monroe, these are serious allegations, but we need to verify their authenticity before making any conclusions." Alicia nodded. "I agree, which is why I've already shared this information with an independent investigator. They're reviewing it as we speak." The room erupted into murmurs, and Daniel's face turned pale. Margaret's composure cracked for a brief moment, a flicker of panic crossing her features. But before she could respond, the door to the meeting room opened and two uniformed officers entered. They approached Daniels, their expressions grim. "Officer Daniels," one of them said, "we need to speak with you." Daniels stood, his bravado replaced by fear. "This is ridiculous. You can't do this." The officer held up a document. "We have a warrant to search your office and belongings. You're also being placed on administrative leave pending further investigation." As Daniels was escorted out, Alicia turned to Margaret. "This isn't just about him," she said quietly. "The truth has a way of coming out, no matter how deeply it's buried." Margaret's face hardened, but she said nothing. In the days that followed, the fallout was swift. Daniels resigned under pressure, and the investigation expanded to include several other individuals implicated in the evidence Rachel had provided. Margaret, too, was placed under scrutiny, her once unshakable authority now in question. But the final twist came when Alicia received a letter in her chambers, unsigned but unmistakable in its tone. It was a warning, a veiled threat that made it clear the fight wasn't over. Alicia read it carefully, then placed it in her drawer alongside Rachel's folder. She knew the battle ahead would be even harder, but she was ready. As she left the courthouse that evening, the sun setting behind her, Alicia felt a sense of quiet resolve. The road to justice was long and fraught with obstacles, but for the first time, she felt the system beginning to shift, and she vowed to keep pushing, no matter what it took.